Exposure therapy with response prevention is a treatment that was designed for anxiety disorders. One of the most common places it's used is with obsessive-compulsive disorder. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is not what we sometimes think. It's not just being overly neat or very fastidious. It has to do with intrusive, obsessional thoughts, impulses, or visualizations in our head that keep coming against our will and that cause a great deal of distress and anxiety. The compulsion part is something we do to relieve the anxiety. Probably the most common one that everybody is familiar with is the germ phobia, obsessive-compulsive disorder. Here, people are afraid of getting germs, and so they wash their hands a lot. We see that if you've ever watched the television show Monk. You can see the germ phobia in action. But what happens with that is the person has a fear that they're getting germs on their hand. They wash their hands over and over again, and they get to the point where they won't touch anything that they're afraid of. They won't touch doorknobs in public places because those might have germs on them. And it can become extreme to the point they won't leave their own house because it's hard not to touch things when you're outside. Exposure with response prevention is a way of dealing with that. What happens with exposure therapy is the person is exposed to the thing they're afraid of. In the case of the obsessive-compulsive person, they're exposed to germs. And this is done on a hierarchy, so they don't start with the most fearful thing, but they start somewhere in the middle, something that provokes anxiety but isn't overwhelming to the person. And then they work their way up that hierarchy by exposing the person to the feared situation or object until the anxiety begins to reside in and of itself. I once worked with a lady who thought her anxiety was just going to go off into orbit like the space shuttle. She was surprised that eventually it began to come down. Over time with exposure and response prevention, there are significant changes. The feared obsession becomes less and less powerful. The need to engage in the compulsion decreases. Well, how does that apply to eating disorders? Eating disorders for many, many people involves tremendous anxiety. It's not germs that they're afraid of, it's calories and fat grams. They're not worried they're going to get contaminated and sick. They're worried that the contamination is going to be fat grams and calories in their stomach that are going to cause them to get fat. They don't avoid germs, they avoid calories. And in some cases, they don't wash their hands with eating disorders, they wash their stomach. Well, how can someone wash their stomach? That's purging. Purging means to clean out. When we purge a file, we clean it out. So a person eats, they begin to obsess about what did I eat? I can't believe that. I feel these feelings in my stomach. It's overwhelming to me. The anxiety builds and then they purge. Or they go for a long walk or run on the treadmill. Or they vow that they're not going to eat anything for 48 hours. And so therefore they're controlling the anxiety by the compulsion. And so it's very much of an obsessive-compulsive process. Well, what works with OCD works with eating disorders. The person's exposed to normal, healthy eating and then prevented from going out and doing the compensatory behaviors. Sometimes those are things we anticipate, like purging and exercise, like I mentioned. Sometimes they're food rituals. The ritual is almost a superstitious way of trying to lower the anxiety caused by food consumption. And what we find is that as a person goes through this regular exposure and response prevention, that the fears and the anxieties and the drives of the compulsion go down. But it's hard, especially when you're doing it on your own, because it gets worse before it gets better. And that's something that's really important to understand, because you're not using your escape behaviors to get away from the anxiety. And so it gets worse. And you're saying, this isn't working, this isn't working. But as the person goes through it for approximately 16 or more weeks over time, it makes a tremendous difference and is very helpful in dealing with the eating disorder.